In this video, we're going to actually implement rooms into our game. We're going to start with one basic room. We're going to learn how to add names and descriptions to those rooms and then output them to the player whenever the player changes rooms, and how to set the player to start off in one room. Let's get started. Okay, so at the end of our last video, we had implemented the go command. So I can type go any direction, or really go anything at this point. I can type go west, and it'll say you go west. But the problem is that we don't have a concept of rooms or space really in our game right now. It's just kind of repeating whatever the player types. So what we need to do is make a room object that we can use in our game. We need to make a room system that will let the player go between rooms, and it'll keep track of which rooms are connected to each other. And so we're going to do that now. Now, in most game engines, if you were making a text adventure and you weren't using like Unity or Unreal or Godot, you were using a framework or code specifically, you'd probably just do this all via code. And at some point with a simple game like a text adventure, you've got to ask yourself, why would I do this in a game engine like Godot or Unity, etc., instead of just kind of rolling it on my own, because there's not a lot of graphical interface. And I would argue there's two reasons for that. One reason why you might want to use Godot or another engine is because it makes it really easy to format what we've got here, this graphical user interface. It's really easy to use Godot's container system, so it does a lot of that work for you. So that's one thing. But even that, if you're pretty good at that, or you would just prefer to do it via code, it's not a big draw. So one other thing that might be really nice about making a game that is not overly graphical in nature, like a text adventure in Godot, is that you get access to a bunch of other built-in editor functions. So for example, instead of just like making a bunch of rooms via code where you just instance this room and this room by just calling a line of code each, like you would in a game framework, or just like if you're writing this in TypeScript or JavaScript or Java, one nice thing we can do is we can actually use Godot's editor to instance all of our rooms in our scene tree and edit them visually. And eventually, one thing I hope we get to do is we can make a visual map of our rooms and edit and connect them like that. So we actually have a visual map editor rather than just having to rely on connecting things via code. So we're not going to get there quite yet. That's something I hope we'll get to in the future, but just wanted to bring that up as a reason why doing a game like this in an engine like Godot is actually might be worth the effort. It might not, depending on what you want to do, but it's something worth considering as you get started. Okay, so let's start building our rooms. So what I'm going to do is come over to our game here, and you'll see now we've got our background. This is really just our graphical user interface. It's probably what I should rename that to, and our command processor. So we've really only got two nodes within our game. We're going to add another one, and this is going to be our room manager. And this is the node we're going to house all of our room nodes in. And so what I'm going to do is create, we'll just keep this as a regular node for now. We might end up making this a control node later on. Again, we don't need to be perfect right now. We can kind of refactor as we need to go. But I'm going to call this room manager. And right now our room manager isn't really going to do anything. We just need it as a parent because we're going to add our room nodes to it. So now we need to actually create our room nodes. And what I'm going to do is add a panel container as a child to our room manager. So I'll select panel container here and add that. And you might be wondering at this point why I'm using a panel container. And it's a very good question, especially because rooms, ostensibly right at the start at least, won't really have a visual representation to the player. But I'm kind of trying to plan ahead a little bit and make a way so that eventually if we do have that visual map I talked about, we've already got some kind of a GUI for our rooms that works really nice. So I'm just going to call this room. There's really no reason, there's no downside to using a panel container here, so we might as well just get it started now. And I'm going to hit W so that I'll hit this move key up here. I'm going to move our room up here. So our room is a panel container right now. It doesn't really have any, there's nothing to it. So we need to start adding some things if we want it to show anything. So one thing we can do is we can add a margin container. And with our margin container, all I want to do is just provide a super simple graphical interface or kind of heads-up display for what our room is. We're not really going to do much with this graphical part, but just to get something there. So now we have a margin container. I'm going to add two things. I'm going to add a VBox container because we want rows here. Again, under my kind of standard style, I'm just going to call this rows because they're stacked vertically, so they're rows. And then what I'm going to do here is add two things. One is a label that I'm going to call room name, and I'm going to duplicate it with Command D, and I'm going to call this room description. We might add more later on, but for now, we'll do this, and I'll just add some basic text, room name, and we'll say this is the description of the room. And in order to make these a little bit, just kind of have a common theme or look to them, I'm going to go to our rect here. And what I'm going to do is set a min size. So right now this has 239 in the X direction. So let's just set it, I think that's a good, let's do 250 pixels wide. And then we will set, let's do 100 pixels high. And this can kind of be our default room. I might make that a little bit bigger, 200. Let's go, we'll do 100 for now. And then I'm going to do a little bit of changing of the fonts here since we've done some work with the fonts before. So I will make our room name be our 24 font, size 24 of the Plex Mono. And our room description is going to be 16. There we go. Just drag those in there. And now all of a sudden, this is what we got. And I want to make our room description label wrap. So I'll say auto wrap, and now it'll automatically fit to the, if a fixed width is set for a parent, it'll automatically fit to that. And I don't want this to wrap, but I might center it. Who knows? Yeah, we can do that for now. And so this is kind of what we got for our room. Let me readjust our room here, our min size. We'll make this 200 just so it looks a little bit better. And there we go. So now we've got a really basic graphical interface into our rooms. Again, we're not going to use this right now. What it will help us see though is from our scene tree, we can kind of get a glimpse of what our rooms look like without having to go into our code. So that is really nice. And then later on, if we end up showing some kind of a map to the player, we might be able to just do a viewport directly into, you know, wherever these are in our scene tree, and our player we'll just be able to see it. So what I'm trying to do is make something right now for our room system that works for us right now, but also is going to make it easy to add cool new features later on. And you might be asking, isn't it bad that these are in our kind of world space? They might show on the screen. And it's a great question. They would if I drag them down here, but remember our camera is, or our game node itself just takes up this space here. So we can have other things in our tree and in our world space as long as they're not within the bounds of our parent node or our camera itself. So if I keep them up here, they'll exist in our world space, but not actually be visible to the player. And you'll see that if I open this up, we can't see our room node. And so this is good because we can maybe just have this random space up here as our map later on, just have a viewport or a camera that looks this kind of a square in here, and we could just look into that. But getting ahead of ourselves, we'll get back to that later on. Okay, so we've got a room node. Let's actually add the script because this is, you know, kind of what is going to determine our gameplay here. So one thing I'm going to do is right click on our room node, and I'm going to say save branch as scene because we want to save this as its own scene that we can continue to reuse as we continue to develop our game. So I'll do that. Then I'll open up our room scene here, and I'm just going to its rect position, set that or restore that to the default. And I'm going to add a script here so that all of our rooms will have it. And it's just going to be room GD, and we'll be good to go. And I'm just going to make sure, since I reset our position on our room node, our base room scene, I'm going to need to drag this one up somewhere else over here so it's not back at 0, 0 since the position got reset. Okay, so let's add some functionality to our room. One thing we'll notice is we've got a room name and a description, so we probably want to set that within our code. So what I'm going to do is add 2 export variables. I'm going to say export, and this will be string, export string var room name, and then I'm going to do the same thing for the room description. This will be room description. Okay, and then we can just default this to room name and default this to this is the description of the room. Okay, perfect. So now we've got these things we can change from the editor. So what I can do, for example, now is come back to our game, and you'll see our room here. I could change this to be house and a random house. So all of a sudden we're able to add rooms and edit them really easily from our scene tree. We don't actually have to do it via code. So that's already a nice step. But what we want to do is actually add some ways to get around and add rooms to our game. Okay, so now we've got a room. I just randomly called it house. You can call it whatever you want. We'll probably change this as we go, but just to get started. Now we've got to tell our game that we need to start it off in this house. We need to actually tell our game this concept of rooms and make sure that we can move between stuff. And there's a couple ways we could do that. We could, for example, have another export variable where we drag one of our rooms in our room manager That's one way to do it. I think what I want to do for now is actually do it via code, despite, how we've been leaning towards the editor earlier on. I think it makes a little bit more sense to start this one off by code, and I'll explain that in a second. Let me just also rename this to be house room so we can actually tell which one it is from the scene tree. And so we need our command processor to know about rooms so that when we type go, the command processor can actually figure out where we're going. But at the same time, our command processor shouldn't be super responsible for doing a bunch of it's not the one that should know about all the different exits and entrances to a certain room. Each room should keep track of that on its own. And the command processor shouldn't be the place where we initialize our game state. That should be in our game script. So what I'm going to do, this is a common pattern of mine whenever I need a parent node to pass data into a child node right at the start. I use a function called initialize. You can really call it whatever you want. That's just my kind of go-to because it's pretty easy to understand. Hey, this is a function that needs to be called when this node should really start running. It's different than the built-in ready because this one can actually be called by a parent. And so what I'm going to do here is just say starting room. And so we're going to have an initialize function where our game is able to pass in the starting room to our command processor. We'll just do pass here. And what that means is that we need to keep track of our current room in our command processor. We could also keep track of this in our game state and pass that in to our command processor here. That might be the better way to separate those concerns. So that might be a better architectural decision, but we'll just kind of start with this now and then we can change it pretty easily later on. So what I'm going to do is just say var current room, and this is going to be null. And so what's going to happen is that when we call initialize and we pass in our starting room, I'm going to say current room equals starting room. So we're going to pass in our starting room and set that to be our current room. And then whenever we process a command, we can use our current room anywhere else to process that. So if we say go west, we can get the west exit of our current room. And then we can change our current room to be the room that is whatever is to the west. So we're going to kind of use that as our pattern just to start working on our command processing. One other important note that we need to think about is how the player and the room should be separated. We could make it so that the player knows what room they're in, but I think it's slightly better design if we make the player a little agnostic of the current room and we let rooms handle all of the items and NPCs and even the player that's in it. And we might have some, we might go back and forth on that later on, but I think it's a good way to try and keep rooms and players separate for right now. So what we need to do is actually pass in and call this initialize function from our game script. So I'm going to come up here, and then when we start our game up in our ready, what I'm going to do, we're going to have to change some of this, but what I'm going to do is we'll add a room manager on ready here. So I'll say on ready var room manager. And this is just going to be a connection, or we're going to just grab our room manager. Pretty simple. And what I'm going to do is say command processor dot initialize, because remember we added that initialize function. And here we need to get our starting room. Now, again, this is where we could have an export variable. We could drag it in or whatever, but I think it's good enough for now. Just say room manager dot get child, and we'll just say 0. So this is going to get the first child of our room manager because get child is 0 indexed. So this is going to be number 1. This will crash if you don't have a child in your room manager, obviously, but we'll just assume we do for now. It's a pretty simple fix. So now what's going to happen is our command processor, whenever our game starts, is going to assume, or it's going to set our current room, the room the player starts in, to be this house room, and then the player will be able to go from there. Now, one thing we want to do, we've added a description and a name to our room. We actually want to change the starting text to line up to what the current room we're in is. So whenever you go to a room, it should say, you are now in this room. Here are the things that are here. Here are the exits, etc. We want to make a new kind of locating output be given to the player so they can understand where they're at each time they change rooms. And so that's what we're going to need to do now. So in order to make that change, we need a way for our command processor to tell our game, hey, there's a new response that has come based on whatever the players just outputted. And right now we really care about moving rooms, but there's a lot of things that are going to need to happen with that. It might be an item to respond and say, hey, the player picked up this item. And so we want to provide an easy way for our command processor to tell our game that there's a new response that needs to be printed out. And so what we're going to do is add a signal to our command processor. So I'm going to say signal, and we're going to just call this response generated. This response generated signal is going to take a parameter, which is going to say response text. And here we're going to pass in the text of the response that needs to be sent to our game script. And so what we can do here on our game is actually connect to our command processor. So we can say command processor.connect, and here we'll say response generated, we'll say self, and we'll say handle response generated. So we are going to need to add this handle response generated signal, or this function that responds to the signal somewhere in our game script. And it's important here that we connect this before we initialize our game. And the reason this is important is because we want to make sure that a response gets printed out when we initialize our game and our player is moved to their starting room. So if we connect this after, when we move our player to the starting room, this initialize will get called before we've actually connected this, so nothing will get printed out. So just make sure you have this line of code before you initialize your command processor. And so we can just come down here. I'll try and group all the things that are doing responses down in this area. So what I'm going to do is just say function, and I'll just command or copy in what I said there, and this will be response text. We'll do pass here. And so you'll notice when we're doing our starting message up on line 22 that we are, or on line 21, we are instancing a response and then saying what that text is. So I'm actually going to just copy 21 to 23. I'm going to cut and paste them, come down here and throw those in. And so what we want to do now is say, we'll just say response here. So whenever a response needs to be generated, we're going to instance our response, which, remember, that is the type of output that we made. It's a scene that we made, a custom one, that should be displayed whenever the game has a response for the player. And then we're going to say response.text equals, and no hard-coded anymore. It's going to be response text. Amazing. And then we're going to add this response to the game. And so now we've made a really dynamic way to do what we were doing with the starting text, but now it's going to be able to respond to anything, not just starting text. So now we've got that. This is going to get called because of this connection. Our handle response generated function will get called when we move to our current room, which is great. Now we just need to actually emit this signal and handle emitting it correctly from within our command processor. And we'll do that right now. So if I go to our command processor, we need to output this script or output this signal whenever the player moves to a new room. And because we're handling our current room here, we're going to keep this within our command processor script because that's where we're handling it. Again, we might move this out to our game later so our command processor doesn't have to do a lot of that state changing stuff. But for now, just to get something that works, we'll keep it in here. And so there's we're going to need to move rooms a couple times. We're going to do it right here when we initialize our game, and we're going to be doing it whenever we go to a new room. And so I'm going to make a helper function down at the bottom here. That's just going to say function, and it'll be change room. And what we're going to do here is emit signal, and this is going to be response generated. And now here we've got to have the text of the response that's generated. And so what we need to do is actually pass in a new room here. And so when we go to this room, we can say new room dot description or room description. And it'd be really nice to make sure that room description is actually a property on a room. I know it is one because if I go to room, I'll see room description, but it'd be nice if Godot helped me by giving me that autocomplete. And so what we're going to do, as we've done before, is come into our room.gd, and I'm going to say class name, and this will be room. And so we'll define an actual class for our room. And now what we can do here is say that new room is of type room. And then if I get rid of room description, start typing it again, you'll see it'll autocomplete. So this is really nice. So whenever we change rooms, we are going to then output our room description. What we could actually do to jury rig this a little bit is do something like, let me just copy this line. So the problem is that our description is not super helpful right now. So we could do, we could add another line like you go to, and then we'll just do new room and then room name. And so what this will do is it'll output two lines. It'll say you go to this new room, and then it'll output the description of that room. So calling this emit signal twice isn't ideal. We can make a better signal or just like a better response type, like a move room response. We can have individual response types, so there's tons of avenues we can explore to make it better, but we'll just do this for now. Again, just trying to get something that works. And what we're actually going to need to do now too is say current room equals new room. And so one thing we're going to need to do is eventually call change room from Go, but what we can definitely do right now is from initialize, we can just say change room and push in starting room. And so whenever we initialize the game, we're going to change rooms. It's not really changing because we don't have a current room, but it'll still work. We're going to change rooms, quote unquote, into the starting room, and we're going to print this out. So now in our game, we don't have to have this hard-coded starting message anymore, because when we initialize our game, it's just going to get printed out. So now that we have it, let's see this in action. So if I run our game, we'll see you go to a house, a random house. Okay, so this is obviously not very helpful at all, but we are now able to actually go to a room and see text specific to that room, which is really, really nice. Okay, so this is what we have, and it's really nice that it's tied to a room now, but there's 3 quick things I want to do before we end this video. One is I want to add back some of our welcome text just to like kind of indicate to the player the game has started and give them some helpful hints. 2, I want to make this message a bit better. And 3, I want to make it so we don't have to emit that signal twice every time we call it. So we'll start with the welcome text because that's going to be the easiest thing to change. And what we're actually going to do is use our new handle response generated function. Now that this is actually doing everything we need, we can just pass in some response text. Also, I think off video I had typed this as a string, so make sure you also do that just to get a little bit of better autocomplete here. But so what I'll do now, just to add some starting text, is I can say handle response generated, and here I'm just going to say welcome to the retro text adventure. You can type help to see available commands. And so it's just a simple message, but now what it's going to do is just show that response right at the beginning, and it just gives the player something to start off with. Welcome to the retro text adventure. The game has started. You can type help to see available commands. So I type help, and I see this helpful message. So it's just a little bit better than what we had before. And okay, cool. That's good. Now I want to edit this message a little bit just to make it better, because you go to house, a random house, is kind of lame. So we'll fix that right now. So if I go to our command processor, rather than saying you go to, what I can say instead is you are now in, and then it'll just be, so you are now in something, like you are now in house, which is just slightly better. So that kind of changes our message a little bit. But the third thing we wanted to do is not call emit signal twice, and this will also do number 2, which is making our message better, is we can actually make our signal take in an array of text. So the problem right now is that when we emit here, we are creating 2 response variables because this response is getting instanced twice because we're calling this function twice. So we don't want to emit 2 signals. We just want to emit one, but potentially pass in multiple text values. And so right now our handle response generated function takes a string. So it just has to be one long string, but there's a couple different things Godot lets us do as far as string processing that can make this look a little bit better. And so what I mean by that is, rather than changing our function here, and we might eventually do that, maybe eventually we'll need different types of responses. We might want to add some more colored text. We might want to have some variations to make our game feel a little bit better. But right now what we can do is actually call emit signal once, but pass in an array of strings that we join together. So in order to do this, we're going to create a new variable, which is going to say variable, we can call it strings or messages, whatever you want. And we're not actually going to create an array. So what we want to do is have an array of strings that we join together with a new line. And so what we can do then is use the same response instance, but then have new lines to kind of differentiate between them, just so it looks a little bit better. And this is going to provide us a lot of flexibility later on to, whenever we change rooms, not only say what room we're in, but also say the exits, the description, the items, etc. So it'll give us flexibility to add all those things later on. The problem though is we don't want to use an array in Godot because basic arrays do not have a join function. Instead, Godot has a built-in type called a pool string array. which is an array specifically meant for strings that's very memory efficient and has a lot of those standard string functions or standard array functions to strings. And so we're going to use that instead. And in order to make that, instead of just creating a basic array like this, we just say pool string array. And we're just going to use the constructor to make one. And what we're going to do here is just have an array. And here we're going to actually add in all of our strings. So this first one, we're just going to copy in and say, grab this, and now we've got this, and we can start going from here. And what I'm going to do now is get rid of this emit response, and we are just going to say strings. And with our strings variable here, we need to make sure that at the end we join them, and our delimiter, is going to be the new line. And if you're not familiar with this new line character, this \n, is a standard character in strings and really in any language and just computer programming in general that has a new line between values. So what this is going to do is for every value in our array, it's going to add a new line to the end of it, which means that when it gets shown to the user, it'll be like hitting the enter key. It'll be the next line down. And so this is going to let us format our strings very nicely. Even though we've got multiple, it's going to join this array into a single string with new line characters in between each separate message. So let's say that we want to have not just our room name, but our room description on the same line. So I can say here, we're going to add another plus, and I'll just have a period here, and I'll say it is, and then we can do some things later with articles. So like a house or the house or like the castle gates. You don't always want to have a or there's different articles you can have. So we'll do some more like string parsing for rooms later on. But here we can just say new room description. And we'll want to have some standard practices for how we name our rooms and descriptions. So one thing we can do is if we always want to display our room description as part of the latter half of a sentence, we can just have a convention now that all of our room descriptions will be lowercase. So I can say a random house that you do not recognize. Okay, so now we've got that, and I can say a house for now. Eventually later, instead of putting the a here, like I said, we could have an article field perhaps, but this will work for now. So now in our command processor, when we print this out, it's going to say you are now in a house. It is a random house you do not recognize. And so that's just going to look and feel a little bit better of a message to the player. It's going to be a little bit more easy to understand and look at. And now we've also got room in our string array here too later on to display the exits. So right now our rooms don't have exits, but we could add a new line that says like exits, and then just like have a list of exits from there. We will just have this as a stub for now, and then in the next video we'll learn how to add exits to our rooms that we can move between. But for now, this should be good. So if we run our game, we'll now see our welcome message up here, welcome to the Retro Text Adventure, and then it'll say you are now in a house. It is a random house that you do not recognize. And then exits, which again, we don't have exits yet, but this is way, way better. Now I can still type stuff and nothing happens. I can type help and go. So we haven't yet connected our go command. That'll be next video when we do exits, but we have rooms in our game now, and these rooms are able to have a name and a description, and we're going to add so much more stuff later on. I'm hoping that we'll get to at least add some stuff like items. But yeah, here it is. Now we've got a game that has rooms, and we're going to be able to actually move between them next video. So get excited for that. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for watching. Hope you found this video helpful. And if you did, a like and subscribe to support the channel are always appreciated. If you have any questions, we'd love to have you in the Discord server. We can help you there. The link to the server is in the description below. And if you found my work helpful, donating a coffee on Buy Me a Coffee is much appreciated. Helps me to continue making great tutorial videos. Link to that also in the description. Thanks, everyone. See you in the next video.